The October air was crisp and cold as Mary sat on the concrete steps outside Valley General Hospital. Her arms ached from holding baby Rose, who had been crying on and off for the past hour. The little one was only 3 days old, and Mary could barely keep her eyes open from exhaustion. 4 other little girls sat around her like ducklings, staying close to their mother. 10-year-old Grace kept trying to quiet baby Rose by making funny faces. 8-year-old Lily held tight to 6-year-old Hope's hand, while 12-year-old Faith sat closest to Mary, her young face showing worry that no child should carry. Mary's husband had walked out of the hospital room that morning when the doctor announced their 5th child was another girl. His exact words still rang in her ears like a painful echo. "I'm done with this circus. 5 girls and not 1 boy. What kind of man does that make me?" She had begged him to stay, to think about their children, but he just kept walking. The sound of his truck starting up in the parking lot felt like the final nail in a coffin. She never saw coming. Now, here she sat with everything she owned, stuffed into 2 grocery bags and a diaper bag that was already running low on supplies. The hospital had been kind enough to let them stay an extra day, but the social worker had made it clear that they needed somewhere to go by evening. Mary looked at the crumpled $20 bill in her pocket. $20 to start a new life. With 5 children. The thought made her stomach turn with fear and shame. "Mama, I'm hungry," little Hope whispered, tugging gently on Mary's coat sleeve. "I know, sweetheart. We'll figure something out soon," Mary replied, though she had no idea how. The local shelter was full and she had no family to turn to. Her parents had passed away years ago, and her sister lived 3 states away with barely enough money to feed her own family. People walked past them on the sidewalk, most avoiding eye contact. A few dropped loose change into Faith's outstretched hand, but Mary felt too proud and too scared to actually ask for help. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Mary noticed an old pickup truck pull up near the hospital entrance. The truck was dusty and well used, but it looked solid and dependable. A tall man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt climbed out slowly, like someone who had been working hard all day. The man had silver hair peeking out from under a baseball cap, and his face was weathered from years of sun and wind. He moved with the careful, steady pace of someone who was used to handling animals and heavy work. In his hands he carried a small bouquet of flowers wrapped in grocery store paper. Mary watched as he walked toward the hospital entrance, but then he stopped. His eyes had landed on her little family huddled together on the steps. For a moment their eyes met, and Mary felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She looked away quickly, focusing on adjusting baby Rose's blanket, but the man didn't keep walking. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, like he was thinking about something important. Then he tucked the flowers under his arm and walked over to where they were sitting. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a gentle voice that reminded Mary of her grandfather. "I don't mean to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing you and your children out here. Is everything all right?" Mary felt tears spring to her eyes. Something about his kind tone broke through the wall she had been building around her heart all day. We're fine," she managed to say, though her voice shook with the light. The man crouched down so he was at eye level with the children. "Well, hello there, young ladies," he said with a warm smile. "That's a beautiful baby you have there." Grace giggled and pointed at baby Rose. "She cries a lot, but Mama says that's normal for babies." "Your Mama's absolutely right," the man said, with a chuckle. "Babies have a lot to say, they just don't know how to use words yet." Mary watched as her daughter seemed to relax around this stranger. There was something about him that felt safe and trustworthy. Maybe it was the gentle way he spoke, or how he looked directly at them without judgment. "My name's Thomas," he sighed, looking back at Mary. "Thomas Mitchell. I run a cattle ranch about 40 miles north of here. I was just visiting a friend in the hospital, but—" He paused, glancing at the bags around them. "It looks like you folks might be in some kind of trouble." Mary felt her walls going back up. "We don't need charity," she said quickly, though even as she said it, she knew how desperate they must look. Thomas held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I didn't mean any offense, ma'am. It's just that I've been where you are." "Maybe not," Exactly, but I know what it's like when life throws you a curveball and you're not sure which way to turn. Baby Rose chose that moment to start crying again, and Mary felt her own tears threatening to spill over. She was so tired, so scared, and so completely out of options. What happened to your husband? Faith asked Thomas directly with the blunt honesty that only children possess. Thomas smiled sadly. She passed away about 15 years ago. Cancer. We never had children of our own, though we always hoped we would. Our daddy left because we're all girls, Lily said matter-of-factly. He wanted boys. Mary felt her face flush with shame, but Thomas just shook his head with what looked like anger on their behalf. Well, that man doesn't know what he's missing, Thomas said firmly. Girls are just as good as boys at anything they set their minds to. Better at some things, if you ask me. Hope giggled at this, and even Faith cracked a small smile. Thomas stood up and looked directly at Mary. Ma'am, I don't know your situation, and I'm not trying to pry, but I've got a big house that's been too quiet for too long. If you and your girls need a place to stay for a while, just until you get back on your feet, you'd be welcome at my ranch. Mary stared at him in shock. We couldn't possibly. You could, Thomas said gently. And before you worry about my intentions, I want you to know that I'm not looking for anything except maybe some company and some life in that old house. I've got plenty of room, and frankly, I could use some help around the place. Mary looked at her daughters, all watching her with hopeful eyes. Baby Rose had finally quieted down and was sleeping peacefully in her arms. The $20 in her pocket wouldn't even buy them dinner, let alone a place to sleep. Why would you help strangers? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out at the parking lot. Because 15 years ago, when my wife was dying, strangers helped me. They brought food when I couldn't cook. They sat with her when I had to work. They reminded me that there's still good in this world, even when everything feels dark. He looked back at Mary, with eyes that held both sadness and kindness. Maybe it's my turn to pass that kindness along. As the hospital lights began to flicker on in the growing darkness, Mary realized she was facing the most important decision of her life. Trust a stranger, or face the night with nowhere to go and 5 children depending on her. I don't even know your last name, she said softly. It's Mitchell, Thomas replied, and I'd be honored to know yours. Williams, Mary said. Mary Williams. Thomas smiled and tipped his hat slightly. Well then, Mrs. Williams, what do you say we get you? And these beautiful girls somewhere warm for the night? Mary sat in the passenger seat of Thomas's pickup truck, Baby Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time all day. The girls were squeezed together in the back seat, unusually quiet as they drove through the small town's main street. The dashboard clock showed 7:30 p.m., and Mary's stomach was doing nervous flips. Thomas had insisted on buying them dinner at a small diner called Betty's Kitchen before they talked about anything else. Can't make important decisions on an empty stomach, he had said with a gentle smile. Now, with warm food finally in their bellies, reality was starting to sink in. Mr. Thomas, Faith spoke up from the back seat, are you really going to let us stay at your house? Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror. That's what I'm hoping to talk about with your mama. But yes, that's my plan. Mary turned to look at him in the dim light from the dashboard. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel loosely, and his profile showed a man who had seen his share of hard times, but hadn't let them make him bitter. I need to know more about this arrangement, Mary said quietly. I have to think about my children's safety. Of course you do, Thomas replied. Any good mother would ask questions. What would you like to know? Mary took a deep breath. First, why are you really doing this? Nobody helps strangers like this without wanting something in return. Thomas was quiet for a moment as they stopped at a red light. The glow illuminated his face, and Mary could see him considering his words carefully. You know how I told you my wife died 15 years ago? He said finally. What I didn't mention was that we tried for years to have children, lost 3 babies before they were born. When Linda got sick, one of the things that hurt her most was knowing our house would always be empty. He paused as the light turned green and they continued driving. I made her a promise before she passed. I told her that someday, if I ever had the chance to help a family that needed a home, I would do it. I guess I've been waiting for the right moment. Grace leaned forward from the back seat. Did your wife go to heaven? Thomas smiled sadly. I believe she did, sweetheart. And I think she's probably pretty happy right now, knowing I might finally be keeping that promise. Mary felt something loosen in her chest. There was something about the way he talked about his wife that made her believe he was telling the truth. What exactly are you offering? She asked. I need to understand the details. Fair enough, Thomas said. I've got a 4-bedroom house. On about 500 acres, it's not fancy, but it's solid and warm. You and the baby would have the master bedroom. The girls could share the other bedrooms however you think is best. Lily bounced a little in her seat. We could each have our own room? If that's what you want, Thomas said with a chuckle. Though my experience with cattle tells me that young ones usually like to stick together. What about money? Mary asked, getting to the heart of her worries. I don't have a job, and I can't pay rent. I won't accept charity, but I also can't offer much in return right now. Thomas pulled into the parking lot of a small grocery store and turned off the engine. He turned to face Mary directly. Here's what I'm thinking, he said. I'm 58 years old, and I've been running that ranch by myself since Linda died. I could use help with the books, the correspondence with buyers, maybe some of the lighter work around the place. You'd be earning your keep, not taking charity. But I don't know anything about ranching, Mary protested. Neither did Linda when we got married, Thomas said. She learned. More importantly, that house hasn't had a woman's touch in 15 years. It shows, Hope giggled. Is your house really messy? Let's just say I'm better with cows than I am with cleaning, Thomas admitted, making all the girls laugh. Mary found herself almost smiling despite her fears. What about the girls? They need to go to school. There's a good elementary school in Cedar Falls, about 20 minutes from the ranch. High school is in the next town over, but they run buses. Faith would probably go there next year anyway. Faith perked up at this. She had been worried about missing more school than she already had. And if this doesn't work out? Mary asked. If we don't get along or if you change your mind? Thomas's expression grew serious. Then I help you find somewhere else to go, and I make sure you have enough money to get started. But Mary, I'm not the kind of man who changes his mind about important things. When I make a commitment, I keep it. The way he said her name made something flutter in Mary's chest. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with respect and kindness. There's something else you should know, Thomas continued. I'm not looking for a wife or a romantic relationship. I loved Linda with everything I had, and I'm not trying to replace her. This would be a practical arrangement between adults who could help each other. Mary felt both relief and a tiny pang of something she couldn't quite identify. Good, she said quickly. Because I'm not looking for another husband. The last one didn't work out so well. Mama, Grace said softly, I like Mr. Thomas. He's nice to us. He bought us real ice cream for dessert, Lily added. Daddy never bought us ice cream. Mary's heart clenched. Her daughters had been through so much, and they deserved better than the fear and uncertainty of the past few days. What about references? She asked. How do I know you're who you say you are? Thomas reached into his wallet and pulled out his driver's license, a business card from Mitchell Ranch, and a worn photo of him and a smiling woman with kind eyes. That's Linda, he said softly, handing Mary the photo. Call Pastor Williams at Cedar Falls Community Church. He's known me for 20 years, or call Doc Peterson at the veterinary clinic. He can vouch for me? Mary studied the photo. Linda had been beautiful, with laugh lines around her eyes and Thomas's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. They looked happy together. You can call anyone you want, Thomas continued. In fact, I'd prefer if you did. I want you to feel completely safe with this decision. Baby Rose stirred in Mary's arms and made a small sound. Mary looked down at her youngest daughter, then back at her other girls who were watching her with hopeful faces. If we did this, she said slowly, it would just be temporary, until I can figure out something more permanent. However long you need, Thomas said. Could be a few weeks, could be longer, that's up to you. Mary looked out the window at the small town around them. It looked peaceful and safe, like the kind of place where children could ride bikes and play outside without fear. "Can we see the house first?" she asked, "before we decide anything final?" "Of course," Thomas said. "It's about a 40-minute drive from here. We could go tonight if you want, or wait until morning if you'd prefer." "Tonight," Faith said quickly. "I want to see it tonight." Mary looked at her oldest daughter and saw determination there. Faith had been forced to grow up too fast in the past few days, and Mary could see that she was ready to find some stability. "All right," Mary said, surprising herself. "Let's go see this ranch of yours, Thomas Mitchell." As Thomas started the truck, and they pulled back onto the road, Mary felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope, maybe, just maybe, they were about to find exactly what they needed. The headlights of Thomas's truck cut through the darkness as they left the small town behind. Mary watched the streetlights fade away, replaced by rolling hills and open farmland. The girls had grown quiet in the back seat, and she could hear Hope's soft breathing that meant she was falling asleep. "How much farther?" Faith asked, pressing her nose against the window to peer into the darkness. "About 20 more minutes," Thomas replied. "We're getting into ranch country now. See how the land opens up?" Mary looked out her window and saw what he meant. The neat suburban houses and small businesses had given way to vast stretches of pasture land dotted with distant lights from farmhouses. The sky seemed bigger out here, filled with more stars than she remembered seeing in years. "It's so dark," Lily whispered, sounding a little nervous. "Different kind of dark than the city," Thomas agreed. "But it's a good dark. Peaceful, once. Your eyes adjust, you can see a lot more than you'd think." Baby Rose stirred in Mary's arms, making soft baby sounds. Mary adjusted the blanket around her, grateful that the little one had finally settled into a better rhythm after their dinner. At the diner. "Mr. Thomas," Grace said sleepily, "do you have animals on your ranch?" "I do indeed," Thomas said, his voice warming with pride. "Got about 200 head of cattle, mostly Black Angus, some of the prettiest cows you ever did see. Also got 3 horses, a handful of chickens, and 2 dogs named Buck and Daisy." Real horses?" Hope asked, suddenly more awake. "Real as the day is long, gentle ones too. Buck's getting older, but he's patient with beginners. Daisy's younger and more spirited, but she's got a good heart." Mary found herself wondering what her life would have been like if she'd grown up in a place like this instead of cramped city apartments. Would her children be different? Would she be different? "That sign there," Thomas said, pointing to a wooden sign barely visible in the headlights, "that marks the beginning of my property line. We've got about 5 more miles of ranch road to go." The truck turned onto a gravel road that wound between wooden fence posts. Mary could make out the shapes of cattle in the distance, dark shadows against the moonlit grass. The road was well maintained but bumpy, and she found herself holding Rose a little tighter. "Is it always this quiet out here?" Faith asked. "Depends on what you mean by quiet," Thomas said with a chuckle. "If you mean no traffic and sirens, then yes. But if you listen close, you'll hear all kinds of sounds. Cows lowing, horses nickering, coyotes singing in the distance, owls calling to each other." "Coyotes?" Lily asked, sounding worried. "Nothing to fear from them," Thomas assured her. "They keep to themselves mostly. They're just part of the natural way of things out here." Mary watched Thomas as he drove, noticing how his whole demeanor seemed to relax as they got deeper into ranch territory. His shoulders weren't as tense, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. This was clearly his element. "There," he said, pointing ahead where a cluster of lights appeared in the distance. "That's home." As they got closer, Mary could make out the shapes of several buildings. The main house was a sprawling single-story structure with a wide front porch and warm yellow light glowing from several windows. To the left stood a large red barn, and beyond that she could see what looked like smaller outbuildings and fenced areas. "It's bigger than I expected," Mary said quietly. "Linda always said we built it too big for just 2 people," Thomas said, a note of sadness creeping into his voice. but she had dreams of filling it with children and grandchildren someday. The truck pulled up to the front of the house and stopped. In the sudden silence after the engine shut off, Mary could hear what Thomas had been talking about. There were indeed sounds all around them, the gentle lowing of cattle somewhere in the distance, the rustle of wind through trees, and what might have been an owl calling from somewhere nearby. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Ranch," Thomas said simply. Faith was the first one out of the truck, practically bouncing with curiosity. "Can we look around?" "It's pretty dark for exploring," Thomas said, "but we can certainly look at the house. Morning will be better for seeing the rest of it." Mary climbed out of the truck carefully, still holding Rose. The air was crisp and clean, carrying scents she wasn't used to, hay earth and something else she couldn't identify but found pleasant, too. Dogs came bounding around the corner of the house, tails wagging furiously. The girls instinctively moved closer to Mary, but Thomas whistled softly and the dogs immediately calmed down. "Easy, Buck. Easy, Daisy," he said. "We've got guests." The larger dog, Buck, was a golden retriever mixed with graying fur around his muzzle. Daisy appeared to be some kind of border collie mix, black and white with intelligent eyes. Both dogs approached slowly, tails still wagging but more controlled now. "Are they friendly?" Hope asked, reaching out tentatively. "Friendliest dogs you'll ever meet," Thomas said. "Buck there has never met a person he didn't like, and Daisy's great with children. She used to help Linda with her garden." Grace giggled as Buck nuzzled her hand, and soon all three older girls were petting both dogs. Even Rose seemed interested in the new sounds and movement around her. "Come on," Thomas said. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." The front porch was bigger than Mary's entire last apartment had been, with a wooden swing and several rocking chairs. Thomas unlocked the front door and reached inside to flip on the lights. "Holy cow," Faith breathed as they stepped inside. The main room was enormous, with high ceilings and exposed wooden beams. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and comfortable-looking furniture was arranged throughout the space. But what struck Mary most was how clean and tidy everything was, despite Thomas's earlier claims about not being good at housework. "This is beautiful," Mary said, genuinely amazed. "Linda had good taste," Thomas said simply. "I've tried to keep things the way she liked them." Grace was already exploring, running her hands along the back of a large leather couch. "It's like a castle," she whispered. "Let me show you the bedrooms," Thomas said, leading them down a hallway. The master bedroom was spacious, with a king-sized bed and its own bathroom. "This would be yours," Thomas said to Mary. "The crib is set up in the corner there for Rose." Mary stared at the room. It was bigger than any bedroom she'd ever slept in, with large windows that probably offered beautiful views during the day. "And these are the other bedrooms," Thomas continued, opening doors along the hallway. Each room was painted in soft, welcoming colors and furnished with comfortable beds and dressers. The girls ran from room to room, calling out their discoveries. "There are 4 bedrooms," Lily announced. "That means we could each have our own room if we wanted," Faith said, though she sounded uncertain about whether that was what she actually wanted. "Or you could share however makes you comfortable," Thomas said. "It's entirely up to you." Mary found herself standing in the kitchen, which was large and well equipped with a farmhouse sink and a big wooden table that could easily seat 8 people. Through the window above the sink, she could see the barn lit up in the distance. "The kitchen's the heart of any home," Thomas said, joining her at the window. "Linda used to say that's where the best conversations happen." "It's overwhelming," Mary admitted quietly. "All of this? I keep waiting for the catch, for you to tell me what you really want in return." Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious. "Mary, I know this seems too good to be true. I know you've probably been hurt by people who made promises they didn't keep, but I'm not those people." He gestured around the kitchen. "This house has been like a museum for 15 years. Beautiful, but empty. No children's laughter, no family dinners, no Christmas mornings with presents under the tree. You'd be giving me something I didn't even realize I was missing." Baby Rose chose that moment to wake up and start fussing. Mary bounced her gently. and Thomas immediately moved to help. She's probably hungry, Mary said, and it's way past her usual bedtime. There's a comfortable chair in the master bedroom for feeding her, Thomas said. And all the bedrooms have good heaters. The girls can pick where they want to sleep tonight. As if summoned by the mention of sleep, Hope appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing her eyes. Mama, I'm really tired. I know, sweetheart, Mary said. Mr. Thomas is going to show us where we can sleep. Are we staying? Grace asked, hope clear in her voice. Mary looked around the kitchen one more time, then at Thomas's patient, kind face. Her practical mind was still listing all the reasons this could be a mistake, but her heart was telling her something different. We're staying, she said quietly, at least for tonight. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was worth more than all the doubts in her mind. For the first time in days, Mary felt like they might actually be safe. Mary woke up to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through windows that faced east. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The bed was so comfortable and the room so quiet that she thought she might still be dreaming. Then, baby Rose stirred beside her and reality came flooding back. She was at Thomas's ranch. They had actually stayed the night. Rose made soft baby sounds, and Mary carefully picked her up, trying not to wake her completely. Through the large bedroom window, she could see rolling green pastures dotted with black cattle. The view was so beautiful it took her breath away. A gentle knock on the door made her jump. Mary, came Thomas's voice. I've got coffee made if you're interested. No rush, though. I'll be out in a few minutes, she called back softly. Grateful that he was being considerate about her privacy, Mary quickly changed Rose's diaper and got herself dressed in the same clothes from yesterday. She needed to think about practical things like laundry and shopping for basic necessities, but those worries seemed smaller somehow in the morning light. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Thomas in the kitchen, scrambling eggs at the stove. He was wearing clean jeans and a blue flannel shirt, his silver hair neatly combed. The kitchen smelled like bacon and fresh coffee. Good morning, he said with a warm smile. Sleep well? Better than I have in weeks, Mary admitted, settling into one of the wooden chairs at the big table. This is very kind of you. My pleasure, Thomas said, pouring her a cup of coffee. The girls are still sleeping, but I heard some stirring from their rooms a few minutes ago. As if on cue, Faith appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair messy from sleep, but her eyes bright with curiosity. Good morning, she said politely. Morning, Faith, Thomas said. Hungry? Within the next 10 minutes, all four girls had wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of breakfast. Thomas had made enough food for an army: scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and even pancakes shaped like animals for the younger girls. Mr. Thomas, Grace said around a bite of pancake, did you really make these look like rabbits? Linda taught me that trick, Thomas said with a grin. She said food tastes better when it's fun to look at. Mary watched her daughters eat with more enthusiasm than they'd shown for anything in days. Hope was giggling at her elephant-shaped pancake, while Lily carefully ate around the edges of her butterfly. Even Faith, who had been trying so hard to act grown-up lately, smiled at her turtle pancake. After breakfast, Thomas said, I thought maybe you'd like to see the rest of the ranch. That is, if you're planning to stick around for a while? Mary felt all eyes turn to her. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing she needed to make some kind of decision about their future. We need to talk about the practical details, she said carefully. I meant what I said about not accepting charity. Fair enough, Thomas said, refilling her coffee cup. What kind of work experience do you have? I worked as a bookkeeper for a small business before Hope was born, Mary said. I'm good with numbers and organizing things. I also did some secretary work when Faith was little. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The ranch paperwork has been piling up something fierce. Tax records, cattle sale documents, feed invoices, veterinary bills. I'm better with the actual ranching than I am with the business side of things. I could help with that, Mary said, feeling a spark of confidence. I actually enjoy organizing paperwork and keeping records straight. What about a salary? Thomas asked directly. What would be fair? Mary hadn't expected him to be so straightforward. About money, I don't know what's reasonable for ranch work. How about we start with room and board for you and the girls, plus $800 a month cash? Thomas suggested. More if you take on additional responsibilities. Mary nearly choked on her coffee. Her last job had paid $10 an hour for part-time work. That's very generous. It's what I'd pay anyone else to do the job, Thomas said simply. Maybe more, considering you'd be living here and available when I need help. Faith looked up from her breakfast. Does this mean we're staying? Mary looked around the table at her daughter's hopeful faces, then at Thomas's patient expression. We can try it, she said finally, for a month. See how it works out for everyone. Can we see the horses now? Hope asked, bouncing in her chair. Thomas laughed, after everyone's finished eating and dressed for outdoor work. An hour later, Mary found herself walking across the ranch yard wearing a pair of Linda's old boots that Thomas had found in the closet. They were a little big, but they'd do for now. The girls were practically vibrating with excitement as they approached the barn. Buck and Daisy trotted alongside them, tails wagging. The dogs had quickly adopted the children as their new best friends, much to everyone's delight. Now, horses are big animals, Thomas was explaining as they walked. They're gentle, but you have to be respectful. No sudden movements or loud noises. The barn was even more impressive on the inside than Mary had expected. It was clean and well organized, with rows of stalls and the sweet smell of hay filling the air. In the first 3 stalls stood the most beautiful horses Mary had ever seen up close. This here's Buck, Thomas said, patting the neck of a large brown horse with kind eyes. He's 22 years old, which makes him a senior citizen in horse years. Buck lowered his head over the stall door, and Grace tentatively reached out to touch his nose. He's so soft, she whispered. And this pretty lady is Daisy, Thomas continued, moving to the next stall where a smaller horse with a black mane was watching them curiously. She's about 10 years old and still likes to think she's young and spry. The third horse was Clearly the youngest, a gorgeous paint horse with brown and white patches. That's Storm, Thomas said. He's only 5, so he's still got some learning to do. Can we ride them? Lily asked eagerly. Someday maybe, Thomas said. But first you need to learn how to be around horses safely. How to brush them, how to clean their stalls, how to feed them properly. Faith stepped closer to Buck's stall. I'd like to learn, she said seriously. I thought you might, Thomas said with approval. Horses are good judges of character. They can tell when someone has a good heart. Mary watched her oldest daughter's face light up with something she hadn't seen in months. Genuine interest. And excitement about the future. What about the cows? Grace asked. Can we see them too? Sure thing, Thomas said. But first, let me show you something else. He led them out behind the barn to a fenced area where a dozen chickens were pecking around in the dirt. These ladies provide us with fresh eggs every day, he said. One of the daily chores is collecting eggs and making sure they have fresh water. Hope clapped her hands together. Real chickens, can I hold one? We'll work up to that, Thomas said with a chuckle. Chickens can be a little skittish until they get used to you. They spent the next 2 hours touring the ranch. Thomas showed them the cattle in the near pasture, explaining how he rotated them between different fields to keep the grass healthy. He pointed out the vegetable garden that Linda had started and that he'd been trying to maintain, though he admitted he wasn't very good at it. Gardens need a woman's touch, he said, looking hopefully at Mary. I've never grown anything bigger than a houseplant, Mary confessed. Neither had Linda when we started, Thomas said. But she learned and she loved it. Said there was something magical about planting a seed and watching it grow. By the time they headed back to the house for lunch, Mary's head was spinning with everything she'd seen. The ranch was bigger and more complex than she'd imagined, but Thomas seemed to manage it all with quiet competence. It's a lot to take in, he said, as if reading her thoughts. It's wonderful, Faith said firmly. I love it here. Me too, added Grace, still talking about the chickens. Mary looked at her daughter's faces, seeing something she'd almost forgotten existed, pure, Enjoy. When was the last time they'd had space to run and explore? When had they last been around animals or seen so much open sky? The school bus stops at the end of the driveway, Thomas was saying. Driver's name is Mrs. Peterson. She's been doing the route for 15 years. Good woman. When would they start school? Mary asked. Monday, if you want. Or we could wait a week, let everyone get settled first. Faith looked at Mary hopefully. Could I start Monday? I've already missed so much school. Mary felt a surge of pride at her daughter's eagerness to learn, despite everything they'd been through. We'll see, she said. Let's get through the weekend first. As they walked back toward the house, baby Rose finally waking up in Mary's arms, Mary realized something had shifted inside her. For the first time since her husband had walked out, she wasn't focused on just surviving the next day. She was actually thinking about the future. Maybe, just maybe, they had found something more than just a place to stay. Maybe they had found a real home. 3 weeks had passed since Mary and her daughters arrived at Cedar Ridge Ranch, and autumn was painting the trees in brilliant shades of gold and red. Mary stood at the kitchen window, watching Faith help Thomas repair a section of fence while the younger girls played with the dogs in the yard. Baby Rose was napping peacefully in her carrier on the counter nearby. The transformation in her children still amazed her. Faith had thrown herself into learning everything about ranch life, following Thomas around like an eager apprentice. Grace had become the official egg collector, proudly bringing in a basket full every morning. Lily had discovered a talent for brushing the horses, and even Shy-Hope was starting to help feed the chickens without being asked. "Mama, look what I found!" Grace called out, running toward the house with something cupped in her hands. Mary opened the back door as Grace carefully climbed the porch steps. "What is it, sweetheart?" "A baby frog," Grace said, opening her hands to reveal a tiny green frog sitting calmly in her palm. "Mr. Thomas says there's a whole pond on the other side of the barn where they live." "That's wonderful," Mary said, marveling at how comfortable her daughter had become with creatures she'd never seen before moving to the ranch. "But maybe we should put him back near the water so he can find his family." Grace nodded seriously and carefully carried the frog back toward the barn. Mary watched her go, then returned to the kitchen where she'd been working on organizing Thomas's business records. The paperwork had been even more chaotic than Thomas had warned her about. Invoices stuffed into shoeboxes, tax documents mixed in with veterinary records, and receipts for everything from cattle feed to fence posts scattered across his desk. But Mary found the work satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. There was something peaceful about bringing order to the chaos. She had just finished entering the latest batch of cattle sale records into her new filing system when Thomas and Faith came through the back door, both looking pleased with themselves. "That fence isn't going anywhere now," Thomas announced, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. "Faith here has got some real skill with tools." Faith beamed at the praise. At 12 years old, she was still young enough to glow when adults noticed her efforts, but old enough to take real pride in doing good work. "Can I help with the cattle tomorrow?" Faith asked hopefully. "You said maybe I could learn to use the herding stick." "We'll see," Thomas said with a smile. "Depends on how Buck's feeling. He's the one who'll be doing the real work." Mary looked up from her paperwork. "Is it safe for her to be around the cattle?" "Safer than you might think," Thomas said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. "Faith's got good instincts around animals. She's calm and patient, and she listens to instructions. Those are the most important things." Faith practically glowed at this assessment. Mary realized that Thomas had a gift for seeing the best in people and encouraging them to live up to it. Her daughter had always been responsible, but here at the ranch she was developing a confidence Mary had never seen before. "Speaking of cattle," Thomas continued, "I've got a buyer coming to look at some of the yearlings next week. Could use your help with the paperwork, Mary." "Of course," Mary said. "What do you need me to do?" "Health records, weight documentation, breeding information. The kind of detailed record keeping that I've been putting off for too long." Mary felt a surge of satisfaction. She was actually contributing something valuable to the ranch's operation. Not just accepting charity. Lily burst through the front door, her cheeks flushed from running. Mama, Daisy let me brush her all by myself today. That's wonderful, honey, Mary said, pulling her daughter close for a hug. Were you gentle with her? Super gentle, Lily said seriously. Mr. Thomas says she likes me because I have quiet hands, Thomas chuckled. That's exactly what Linda used to say about working with animals. It's not about being strong or fast, it's about being calm and gentle. The mention of his late wife still brought a note of sadness to Thomas's voice. But Mary had noticed that he seemed to find comfort in sharing Linda's wisdom with the children. It was as if he was keeping her memory alive by passing on the things she had taught him. Hope appeared in the kitchen doorway, having quietly slipped into the house while everyone was talking. She was holding something behind her back and looking, excited about a secret. What do you have there, sweetie? Mary asked. Hope giggled and brought her hands forward, revealing a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the field behind the barn. These are for you, Mama. Mr. Thomas showed me which ones were prettiest. Mary felt her throat tighten with emotion. The flowers were simple, black-eyed Susans and purple asters, but Hope had arranged them with the serious care of a professional florist. They're beautiful, Mary said, accepting the bouquet. Thank you, baby. I'll get you a jar to put them in, Thomas said, getting up from his chair. As he moved around the kitchen looking for a suitable vase, Mary noticed how naturally he had begun including himself in their family moments. The afternoon routine had become comfortable and predictable. After lunch, Thomas would work on ranch business while Mary continued with the paperwork or household tasks. The children would play outside, always within sight of the house. Until it was time for homework and dinner, Faith had enrolled in the local middle school and was thriving despite the upheaval in her life. Her teacher, Mrs. Collins, had called just yesterday to say that Faith was not only catching up academically, but showing real leadership in group projects. She's got a maturity about her that's impressive for a 12-year-old, Mrs. Collins had told Mary. But she also seems happier than when she first started, more settled. The younger girls would start school after the weekend. Mary had been nervous about how they would adjust, but Thomas had introduced them to several neighbor families with children their ages, and the transition seemed less daunting now. Mary, Thomas said, returning with a mason jar filled with water. For Hope's flowers, I've been thinking about something. What's that? Mary asked, arranging the wildflowers in the jar. Winter's coming, and there are some things we should probably discuss, practical things. Mary felt her stomach tighten slightly. Had he changed his mind about their arrangement? Was he preparing to ask them to leave? What kind of things? She asked carefully. Well, for starters, you and the girls are going to need warmer clothes. It gets cold out here, and I know you didn't have time to pack for a Montana winter. Relief flooded through Mary. Oh, yes, that's a good point. There's a good store in town for basics, but I was thinking we might need to make a trip to the bigger shopping center in Billings. Get everyone properly outfitted. Faith looked up from where she'd been listening to the conversation. Are we staying for the winter? The question hung in the air. Mary realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks she had stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement. The children had settled into routines. She was genuinely enjoying her work, and Thomas had become, he'd become family. If Mr. Thomas doesn't mind having us, Mary said carefully, I'd like to stay. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was answer enough, but he said it anyway. I'd mind if you left. Hope clapped her hands together. Does that mean we get to see snow? Real snow? More snow than you'll know what to do with, Thomas promised. And I'll teach you how to build snow forts and have snowball fights. Can we help with the animals in winter too? Grace asked. Animals need even more care in winter, Thomas said. They'll depend on us to make sure they have enough food and water and that they stay warm. It's important work. Mary watched her daughters' faces light up at the prospect of being needed, of having important responsibilities. When was the last time they'd felt truly useful and valued? There's something else, Thomas said, his tone becoming more serious. I want to make sure you feel completely comfortable here. If there's anything about our arrangement that isn't working, Or if you need more privacy, or if the girls need anything at all, I want you to tell me." Mary looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their daily life. Through the window, she could see the barn where her daughters had learned to care for animals, and the fields where they ran and played with more freedom than they'd ever known. "Thomas," she said quietly, "for the first time in years, I feel like my children are truly safe and happy. That's worth more to me than anything else in the world." Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Then welcome home, Mary Williams, for as long as you want to stay." As the sun began to set over the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Mary realized that home wasn't just a place. It was the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being valued and cared for. And somehow, against all odds, they had found that here. The first snow of winter arrived in December like a white blanket covering the entire ranch. Mary stood at the kitchen window, watching her daughters build their first snowman while Thomas showed them how to pack the snow just right. Baby Rose sat in her high chair, clapping her hands at the sight of the swirling white flakes outside. Everything had been going so well for the past 2 months that Mary had almost forgotten what it felt like to worry constantly. The children were thriving in school, the ranch work was satisfying, and Thomas had become like a grandfather to her daughters. But she should have known that peace never lasted forever. The trouble started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in late December. Mary was working in Thomas's office, organizing tax documents for the upcoming year, when the phone rang. "Cedar Ridge Ranch," she answered, as she had learned to do. "I want to speak to my wife," came a voice that made Mary's blood run cold. It was Jake, her ex-husband, the man who had walked out on them at the hospital 3 months ago. "Jake," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper, "how did you find us?" "Wasn't that hard?" Jake replied, his tone sharp and angry. "Small towns talk. Word gets around when a woman shows up with 5 kids and moves in with some old rancher." Mary's hands began to shake. "What do you want?" "I want to see my children." Jake said, "I've got rights, Mary. You can't just disappear with my kids." "You gave up those rights when you abandoned us?" Mary replied, finding some strength in her voice. "You walked away from us when we needed you most. I was upset," Jake said. "A man needs sons to carry on his name. But I've been thinking, and maybe the girls could be useful on a ranch. Maybe this setup you've got going could work for me too." Mary felt sick to her stomach. Jake wasn't interested in his daughter's well-being. He was interested in what the ranch could offer him. "No," Mary said firmly. "You're not welcome here." "We'll see about that," Jake said. "I'll be there tomorrow to collect my family." The line went dead, and Mary sat staring at the phone in her shaking hand. Through the office window, she could see Thomas teaching Faith how to check the cattle's water troughs in the snow. Her daughter was laughing at something he said, her cheeks red from the cold air. How could she protect her children from their own father? "Mary?" Thomas's voice came from the kitchen. "Everything all right?" Mary quickly wiped her eyes and walked out to meet him. He was stomping snow off his boots and hanging up his heavy coat. "Thomas," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts. "To stay calm, we need to talk." Something in her tone made him look up sharply. "What's wrong?" "My ex-husband called. He's coming here tomorrow." Thomas went very still. "What does he want?" "He says he wants to see the children, but I think he's more interested in what he can get from being here. He mentioned that the girls could be useful on a ranch." The expression that crossed Thomas's face was unlike anything Mary had seen before. His jaw tightened and his eyes grew hard as steel. "Over my dead body," he said quietly. "Thomas, I don't want to bring trouble to your home," Mary said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Maybe we should leave before he gets here." "Leave?" Thomas turned to face her fully. "Mary, this is your home now. Your children's home. No man who abandoned his family has any right to show up here and disrupt their lives." But legally, he walked away from his responsibilities," Thomas interrupted. "And I won't let him hurt those girls." Faith came through the back door just then, her face glowing from the cold and exercise. The water troughs are all clear, she announced proudly. Buck really likes working in the snow. Mary tried to smile at her daughter, but Faith was perceptive enough to notice something. Was wrong. What's the matter, Mama? Faith asked, her expression becoming concerned. Mary looked at Thomas, uncertain how much to tell the children. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. Your father called, Mary said gently. He wants to visit. Faith's face went through several emotions, confusion, fear, and then something that looked like anger. Why? She asked. He didn't want us before. Sometimes adults make mistakes and then try to fix them, Mary said, though she didn't believe for a second that Jake had changed. I don't want to see him, Faith said firmly. He made you cry all the time. He yelled at us for being girls. He left baby Rose at the hospital. Thomas knelt down so he was at Faith's eye level. Faith, no one is going to make you do anything you don't want to do. This is your home, and you're safe here. Promise? Faith asked, her voice small. I promise. Thomas said with such conviction that even Mary felt reassured. The next day arrived gray and cold, with fresh snow falling steadily. Mary had barely slept, jumping at every sound outside. She had gotten the younger girls off to school as usual, not wanting to worry them until she knew what Jake actually intended to do. Faith had asked to stay home, and Mary had agreed. Her oldest daughter deserved to know what was happening around. Noon they heard the sound of a truck coming up the ranch road. Mary's stomach clenched as she recognized the engine sound of Jake's old pickup. Stay in the house, Thomas told Mary and Faith. I'll handle this. No, Mary said, surprising herself with her firmness. This is something I need to face. Thomas studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Then we'll face it together. Jake's truck pulled up to the house, and Mary's ex-husband climbed out. He looked the same as always, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came from never doubting that he deserved whatever he wanted. Mary, Thomas, and Faith stepped out onto the front porch. Buck and Daisy immediately positioned themselves between the family and the stranger, their hackles raised slightly. Mary, Jake said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, you're looking good. Ranch life agrees with you. What do you want, Jake? Mary asked, proud that her voice stayed steady. I want my family back, Jake said. I've been thinking about what I said at the hospital, and I realize I was hasty. A man needs his children, even if they are all girls. You forfeited any claim to these children when you walked away, Thomas said quietly, but there was steel. In his voice, Jake's attention shifted to Thomas for the first time. And who are you exactly? The hired help? I'm the man who's been taking care of your family since you abandoned them, Thomas replied calmly. Jake's face darkened. They're not your family, they're mine. Family isn't about blood, Faith spoke, up suddenly, stepping closer to Thomas. It's about who takes care of you and loves you. Mr. Thomas is more of a father to us than you ever were. Jake's expression grew ugly. You don't know what you're talking about, girl. I'm your father, and you'll do as I say? No, she won't, Mary said, stepping protectively in front of Faith. You gave up that right when you chose to leave us with nothing. I've got legal rights, Jake said, his voice rising. I can take you to court. Go ahead, Thomas said calmly. Let a judge hear about how you abandoned a woman with 5 children, including a newborn, with no money and no place to go. Let them hear about how you walked away because you were disappointed in the gender of your children. Jake looked between Mary and Thomas, clearly realizing that his plan wasn't working the way he'd expected. This isn't over, he said finally. Those are my children, and I'll get them back. No, Mary said with more strength than she'd felt in years. It is over. You made your choice 3 months ago. We've made ours. Jake stood there for a long moment, snow falling around him, before finally getting back in his truck. As he drove away, Mary felt something she hadn't expected, not relief, but freedom. Is he really gone? Faith asked quietly. He's gone, Thomas said, putting a protective arm around both Mary and Faith. And if he comes back, we'll be ready for him. That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table sharing stories about their day, Mary realized something important had happened. She had stood up to Jake not as a victim, but as a woman who knew her own worth and the worth of her children. "Mama," Grace said, looking up from her mashed potatoes, "why did our old daddy come here?" Mary considered her answer carefully. Sometimes people realize they made mistakes and want to fix them, but sometimes it's too late to fix things. "I'm glad it's too late," Lily said firmly. "I like our life here." "This is our real family now," Hope added. Smiling at Thomas. Thomas cleared his throat, clearly moved by the children's words. "I couldn't agree more," he said softly. As Mary tucked her daughters into bed that night, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, true security. Not because Jake was gone, but because she had found the strength to protect her family and the wisdom to recognize where they truly belonged. Spring arrived at Cedar Ridge Ranch like a gentle awakening after a long, peaceful sleep. Mary stood in the garden behind the house, watching tiny green shoots push their way up through the dark soil. She had planted the seeds herself in late March, following the handwritten notes that Linda had left in her gardening journal. 6 months had passed since Jake's unwelcome visit, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The children were thriving in ways Mary had never imagined possible. Faith was now helping Thomas with the more complex ranch work, showing a real gift for understanding cattle behavior. Grace had become the ranch's unofficial veterinary assistant, always knowing which animals needed extra attention. Lily and, Hope had discovered they could train the chickens to come when called, and even baby Rose was toddling around the ranch yard, chattering in her own special language to anyone who would listen. But it was the changes in Mary herself that surprised her most. She had grown stronger, more confident, and somewhere along the way had stopped looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next disaster to strike. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly at peace. "Those tomato plants are coming." "Along noisily," came Thomas's voice from behind her. Mary turned to find him approaching with 2 cups of coffee, his silver hair catching the morning sunlight. He handed her one of the cups and stood beside her, both of them looking out over the small garden that had become Mary's special project. "Linda's notes are incredibly detailed," Mary said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "It's like having her here to guide me through every step." Thomas smiled, but Mary noticed something different in his expression lately. A warmth when he looked at her that hadn't been there in the beginning. It made her heart do strange little flutters that she tried to ignore. She would have loved seeing someone care for her garden again, Thomas said softly. She always said plants grew better when they were tended by someone who loved them. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee and watching Faith lead Buck out to the near pasture. The horse and the girl had formed such a strong bond that Thomas often joked that Buck listened to Faith better than he listened to him. "Mary," Thomas said suddenly, his voice taking on a tone she hadn't heard before. "There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about." Something in his voice made Mary's pulse quicken. "What is it?" Thomas set down his coffee cup on the fence post and turned to face her fully. "When you and the girls first came here, I thought I was just helping a family in need. I told myself it was about keeping a promise to Linda and filling up an empty house." Mary felt her breath catch in her throat. "And now?" "Now I realize I was lying to myself," Thomas said, his eyes serious but warm. "Somewhere along the way, you stopped being guests in my house and started being everything I didn't know I was missing." Mary's hand trembled slightly as she set down her own coffee cup. Thomas. "I know this is complicated," Thomas said quickly. "I know you came here to escape one relationship that went wrong, and the last thing you probably want is to get involved in another one. But I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship." Mary looked into his kind, weathered face and felt something she had thought was broken forever stirring back to life. When Jake had walked out, she had convinced herself that she was done with love, done with trusting her heart to anyone. But Thomas was nothing like Jake. Where Jake had been selfish and demanding, Thomas was generous and patient. Where Jake had seen her children as disappointments, Thomas saw them as blessings. "I never expected this," Mary said quietly. "When I agreed to come here, I thought I was done with ... with feeling things like this. And now? Thomas asked gently. Mary took a deep breath, surprised by her own honesty. Now I find myself looking forward to our morning coffee together. I catch myself watching you teach the girls new things and thinking about how lucky they are to have you in their lives. I see the way you've made this place feel like home for all of us, and She paused, hardly believing what she was about to say. And I think I'm falling in love with you, she finished in a whisper. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like sunrise after a long night. Mary Williams, he said softly, you just made me the happiest man in Montana. Before Mary could respond, Grace came running around the corner of the house, clearly on a mission. Mama! Mr. Thomas, she called out. Come quick. Rose is walking. Really walking? Thomas and Mary exchanged a look that mixed amusement with something deeper, then hurried toward the house where they could hear excited voices coming from the front porch. Sure enough, baby Rose was taking careful steps between Faith and Lily, her chubby arms stretched out for balance. Every few steps she would plop down on her bottom and giggle before pulling herself back up to try again. Look at her go, Thomas said with pride. As if Rose were his own granddaughter, Mary watched Thomas's face as he cheered on Rose's wobbly progress, and her heart swelled with love for this man who had embraced her children as completely as if they had been born to him. She's been practicing in secret, Hope announced importantly. I saw her holding onto the couch yesterday and taking steps. Smart girl, Thomas said, scooping Rose up when she toddled his direction. Wanted to surprise everyone when she was ready. Rose babbled something that sounded like Papa and patted Thomas's cheek with her small hand. The word hit Thomas like a lightning bolt, and Mary saw his eyes fill with tears. Did she just? Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. I think she did, Mary said softly, feeling tears of her own starting to fall. Faith looked between Mary and Thomas, her perceptive 12-year-old mind clearly picking up on the emotional undercurrents of the moment. Are you two going to get married? She asked with typical preteen directness. Mary felt her cheeks flush bright red, but Thomas just laughed. That depends, he said, looking directly at Mary, on whether your mother would be willing to marry an old rancher who loves her and her daughters more than his own life. You're asking me to marry you? Mary asked, her heart pounding. I'm asking. If you'd consider it, Thomas said gently. I know it's fast, and I know you might need time to think about it. But Mary, I want to be your husband and their father in every way that matters. I want to make this official, make this family real. Grace clapped her hands together. Say yes, Mama. Please say yes. We like having Mr. Thomas as our daddy, Lily added earnestly. Hope nodded vigorously. He's the best daddy ever. Mary looked around at her daughter's eager faces, then at baby Rose, who was contentedly playing with the buttons on Thomas's shirt, and finally at Thomas himself. This kind, generous man who had given them everything when they had nothing, who had loved her children unconditionally, and who was now offering to love her the same way. Yes, she said, hardly believing the word was coming out of her mouth. Yes, I'll marry you. The cheer that went up from her daughters could probably be heard all the way to town. Faith and Grace started jumping up and down, Lily began spinning in circles, and Hope ran to hug both Mary and Thomas at the same time. When? Faith asked excitedly. When will you get married? Thomas and Mary looked at each other and laughed. How? About this summer? Thomas suggested. Give us time to plan something nice. Can we have the wedding here on the ranch? Grace asked, with the horses and everything. I can't think of anywhere I'd rather get married, Mary said, looking around at the place that had become home to all of them. As the excitement died down and the children ran off to share the news with Buck and Daisy, Thomas and Mary found themselves alone again. Are you sure about this? Mary asked quietly. Marriage is a big step. Thomas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Mary, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You and those girls have brought this ranch back to life. You've brought me back to life. I love you. Mary said, the words feeling both scary and wonderful as she spoke them. I love you too, Thomas replied, leaning down to kiss her gently. All of you, forever. As they stood there holding hands in the spring sunshine, surrounded by the sounds of children's laughter and the peaceful rhythm of ranch life, Mary realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin not with passion, but with kindness. And sometimes the best families are the ones you choose rather than the ones you're born into. 1 year and 3 months after that desperate day at the hospital, Mary stood on the front porch of Cedar Ridge Ranch wearing a simple white dress that Linda's sister had sewn for her. The July morning was perfect, clear blue skies, gentle breeze, and the kind of golden sunlight that made everything look like a painting behind her. The house buzzed with activity as neighbors and friends from town prepared for the wedding ceremony. Mary had been amazed by how quickly the local community had embraced her family. What had started as curious glances at the grocery store had turned into genuine friendships with other ranch wives who understood the rhythm of rural life. "Mama, you look like a princess," Hope said, appearing beside Mary in her yellow flower girl dress. At 7 years old, Hope had lost much of her shyness and now approached life with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved unconditionally. "Thank you, sweetheart," Mary said, smoothing down Hope's carefully braided hair. "Are you excited about the ceremony?" "I'm excited about the cake," Hope said honestly, making Mary laugh. Mrs. Peterson from the church had insisted on making a 3-layer chocolate cake, despite Mary's protests that something simple would be fine. But the church ladies had taken over most of the wedding planning, declaring that Thomas Mitchell deserved a proper celebration after 15 years of being alone. Faith appeared in the doorway wearing a soft blue dress that complemented her growing maturity. At 13 now, she was starting to show signs of the young woman she would become, but today her face held the pure joy of a child whose world had finally become stable and safe. "The pastor just arrived," Faith announced, "and Mrs. Collins brought enough food to feed half the county." Mary shook her head in amazement. "I still can't believe how kind everyone has been." "They love Mr. Thomas," Faith said simply. "And they can see how happy he is now," Mrs. Peterson told me. "She hasn't seen him smile this much since before Mrs. Linda got sick." Through the screen door, Mary could hear baby Rose babbling excitedly and the sound of Thomas's deep laughter in response. Rose was 15 months old now and had appointed herself the ranch's official greeter, toddling up to visitors with her arms outstretched and an enormous smile on her face. "Mama," Grace called from inside the house. Rose pulled all the flowers out of the centerpiece again. Mary sighed and started toward the door, but Faith stopped her. "I'll handle it," Faith said with the authority of a big sister who had learned to manage chaos. "You just worry about getting married." The ceremony was planned for 10 o'clock in the ranch's front yard, under the big oak tree that Thomas and Linda had planted when they first bought the property. White chairs borrowed from the church were arranged in neat rows, and garlands of wildflowers decorated the makeshift altar. Lily burst through the front door, her green dress slightly wrinkled but her face glowing with excitement. "Mr. Thomas is getting dressed in the barn," she announced. "Buck tried to eat his tie." Mary laughed, picturing Thomas in his one good suit trying to keep the horse from destroying his wedding attire. He had wanted to wear his everyday clothes, saying that fancy outfits weren't practical for a rancher, but the girls had insisted he needed to look special for their wedding day. "Mrs. Williams?" came a voice from behind her. Mary turned to find Pastor Williams from the Cedar Falls Community Church, the same man who had served as Thomas's reference when she was still deciding whether to trust him. The pastor was a kind man in his 60s who had married Thomas and Linda 22 years earlier. "Are you ready for this?" he asked with a warm smile. "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Mary said, surprised by her own certainty. The past few months of engagement had only confirmed what Mary had known in her heart when she said yes to Thomas's proposal. This wasn't just about finding security for her children or companionship for herself. She genuinely loved this quiet, steady man who had shown her what real partnership looked like. "Good," Pastor Williams said, "because Thomas has been pacing around that barn for the past hour like a nervous teenager." "Really?" Mary asked, touched that Thomas was feeling wedding jitters too. "Really, Doc Peterson had to threaten to tranquilize him like one of his cattle if he didn't calm down. Mary could hear the sounds of guests arriving, car doors slamming, voices calling greetings, children laughing as they ran around the yard. The guest list wasn't large, but it included everyone who mattered in their new life. Neighbors, church, friends, Thomas's cattle buyers who had become personal friends over the years, and the teachers from the girls' school. "Mama," Grace said, appearing with Rose balanced on her hip. "It's time!" Mary's heart began to beat faster. Through the front window, she could see the guests taking their seats and Thomas standing under the oak tree in his dark suit. Even from a distance, she could see how handsome he looked and how nervous he seemed. Faith lined up the younger girls in their processional order, Lily first as the youngest bridesmaid, then Grace carrying Rose as the flower girl and ring bearer, combined, and Hope bringing up the rear with Mary's simple bouquet of wildflowers from the ranch. "Remember," Faith said seriously, "walk slowly and don't run ahead." "I won't run," Lily promised. "I might run," Hope said with a grin. Making everyone laugh, Mary watched through the window as her daughters walked down the makeshift aisle, each one stopping to give Thomas a hug before taking their places. The sight of him embracing each of her children as his own brought tears to Mary's eyes. "Your turn," Pastor Williams said gently. Mary took a deep breath and stepped out onto the front porch. The moment she appeared, all conversation stopped and every face turned toward her. But Mary only had eyes for Thomas, who was standing under the oak tree with the biggest smile she had ever seen. She walked slowly across the yard, her bare feet feeling the soft grass beneath them. This wasn't a fancy wedding with organ music and hundreds of guests, but it was perfect, it was real. It was theirs. When she reached Thomas, he took her hands in his, and she could feel them trembling slightly. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "So do you," she whispered back. Making him chuckle, Pastor Williams began the ceremony with words about love and commitment, about the blessing of bringing two families together to create something new and strong. But Mary found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been broken and desperate, with no hope for the future beyond simply surviving another day. Today she was standing in front of God and their community, promising to spend her life with a man who had shown her what unconditional love really meant. "Do you, Thomas Mitchell, take Mary Williams to be your wife, and do you promise to love and care for her daughters as your own children?" "I do," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying across the yard. "Do you, Mary Williams, take Thomas Mitchell to be your husband, trusting him with your heart and the hearts of your children?" "I do," Mary said, her voice strong and sure. "Pastor." Williams smiled. "Then by the power invested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride?" Thomas leaned down and kissed Mary gently while their guests erupted in cheers and applause. Rose clapped her hands and shouted, "Papa!" which made everyone laugh and cheered even louder. As they broke apart, Mary looked out at the faces of their friends and neighbors, then at her daughters who were beaming with joy, and finally at Thomas whose eyes were bright with tears of happiness. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Mitchell," Thomas said softly. "Mrs. Mitchell." Mary liked the sound of that. The reception was a wonderful chaos of food, laughter, and children running around the yard while the adults shared stories about Thomas and Linda, and about Mary's family's journey to the ranch. Someone had brought a guitar, and soon there was music and even some dancing on the front porch. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch. Mary found herself sitting on the porch swing with Thomas, watching their children play with the other kids while Buck and Daisy supervised from their spot under the tree. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, taking her hand in his. Mary looked around at the scene before them, Faith teaching a younger boy how to brush a horse, Grace showing off her egg-collecting skills to some visiting cousins, Lily and Hope leading a group of children in a game of tag around the barn, and Rose toddling between various adults who were all eager to pick her up and shower her with attention. "Not a single one," Mary said honestly. "This is home. This is family. This is everything I never dared to dream we could have." Thomas squeezed her hand. "Linda would have loved today," he said quietly. "She would have loved you and the girls." Think she did love us, Mary said. I think she sent us to you. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mary realized that sometimes the most beautiful endings are really just beginnings in disguise. A year ago, she had thought her story was over. Today, she understood that it was just starting. Home wasn't just a place. It was this feeling of belonging, of being valued and cherished exactly as you are. It was the sound of children's laughter echoing across open fields, the comfort of strong arms around you at the end of a long day, and the certainty that tomorrow would be better than today. Mary Williams Mitchell was finally, truly home at last.